All right, we're going to talk about using a bubble humidifier for the oxygen concentrators. This is a bubble humidifier here. A bubble humidifier is just a two-piece canister. If you unscrew the top of it, the lid comes off like this, and you can see that there's a straw portion that goes down inside the jar. Now the jar should be filled with distilled water. Use distilled because as it dries, it'll be a lot cleaner than tap water would be without the minerals in it. So fill it about 2/3 full, 3/4 full, something like that, with the distilled water. And then make sure, notice there's threads there, of course, so make sure that those threads are evenly tight, put it on there even and tight. Don't cross thread it. And then make sure it's quite snug. So snug it up real good before you assemble it and put it on the concentrator. Of course, the reason we're using the humidifier is because the oxygen that comes out of these concentrators is very dry. There's no humidity in it at all. So having the nasal cannula with the dry air in your nose all the time can be rather irritating. So this can help. A bubbler like this does not make a mist. What it's going to do is just bubble the oxygen or push it through the straw, allow the oxygen to bubble up through the water, and therefore picking up humidity as it comes through that way. So now to put it on, you'll notice that on the bubbler there is a threaded inlet, a nut on the top, and that has to screw onto something, of course, in order to attach it. You'll notice, though, the outlet on these two concentrators are just stem adapters. They just stick out like so, so there's nowhere to put this. So in order to put the humidifier on, we're going to need a tube that fits between them. So the tube that I'm going to use, I'm going to go ahead and put the bubbler right here on this elastic strap on the Humidifier concentrator. And the tube that I'm going to use has a threaded inlet and just a slip-on outlet. So in order to assemble this, what you'll do is just take the threaded inlet and that will go on that nut. So that's how we get the tubing attached into the humidifier. We'll tighten that up. All these connections you want to make sure they're not cross-threaded and make sure they're on there snug so that there's no leaks. So now I can go ahead and hook this up to the outlet of the concentrator, and that allows the oxygen to go in to the bubbler, through the straw, and then bubble out, and then through the humidifier outlet right here. So that's where you would attach the cannula. So I'm going to show you on the other machine, and then I'll turn it on and we'll go through a couple things, but that's how you attach it to the Humidifier concentrator. We can do the same thing over here with this Respironics Everflow concentrator, and there's a strap, it's a Velcro strap that fits on the back, and I could loosen that and then tighten it down if I wanted to. For right now I'm going to leave it loose, but the process is the same. So I'm just going to take this tube and put it on the outlet of the concentrator. I'm going to turn the concentrator on now. I'm going to make sure this is snug. Turn the concentrator on, and you'll notice now that the oxygen is bubbling up through the humidifier. And that's exactly the action we want. We want to make sure that we're getting the oxygen bubbling up, picking up a little humidity, and bringing it out to the user to help with a little bit of a humidification. So there is not a mist, it just bubbles through the bubbler as so. So our outlet now, rather than being here to attach the cannula, we're going to take the oxygen cannula tube and attach it here. So this would be the complete setup for doing it. So it would look like this. So you can see the oxygen is coming through this tube, going through the threaded inlet connector there. Oxygen is bubbling up through the water and then coming out here. Now, a couple of things that we want to talk about, just that can happen, that we want to try to prevent any problems with using the humidifier. Number one, humidifiers, because of the water in them, are susceptible to building up bacteria. So we want to make sure that we clean it out. So once a week, take it apart, separate it, warm soapy water, wash it, nice warm soapy water, rinse it real well, leave it open, and let it air dry for the day, all right? And that'll help keep it clean. And then refill it with your distilled water again, with fresh water. The other thing that happens sometimes is you end up with water in the tubing. And especially when you have 25 or 50 feet of extension tubing, what happens is there's oxygen coming out of here, of course, that's a little bit warmer than room air because the motor is running here, warming up the oxygen. It picks up a fair amount of humidity, but then it goes right down to the floor and it cools down. So when we have that cooling in the tubing, we get condensation. And it can get to the point where you can get water bubbling up through your nose and bubbling in the tubing. If that happens, what I recommend is that you just unscrew the jar, empty the water, screw it back in, and just let it run dry to dry the tubing out. All right? And then once it's dry, you can go ahead and add water to it again and put it back in. If you're having a lot of trouble with that, maybe just fill the jar halfway. Don't put as much water into it. The other thing that happens that we want to talk about is leaks. And this is something that's really can be problematic for using a humidifier. And here's a real easy way to check. So in checking the flow with the concentrator, I'm going to disconnect the tubing here. And as you know, this is where the oxygen comes out. One thing I want you to notice, if you could look down at that flow gauge right now, when I occlude the outlet, do you see the ball drop? So when I occlude it, what I'm showing you is that if there's an occlusion in here, the ball will drop, all right? And that's a real good test for our system. So if I've got long tubing and I'm wondering if I'm losing any oxygen, one thing I can do is real simply take the cannula with that attached here. If I pinch the prongs on the tubing, I should get that ball to drop. When I let up, the ball comes back up. What that shows me is that I've got a sealed circuit so that there's no leaks in that tubing whatsoever, okay? The reason I'm showing you that is because we can do the same thing with this jar. So if I put this back together, here we put the tubing back on the outlet, and we've got oxygen bubbling up through here. Now if I wanted to do that same test, what I would do is put my finger over the outlet on the bubbler. And it takes a little bit longer because it has to build up pressure, but that ball should drop now again. When I plug this, the ball will start to drop. When I let go, you notice that pop. So what that means is that there's pressure building up in the jar, which tells me that I've got a tight system. So that means it's working great. Now one thing I want to show you, it's a little bit deceiving, because if the top of the jar is loose, and this happens, we'll maybe find out from a user, they'll say that I don't feel like I'm getting any oxygen through the tubing. And a good way to test it then is to do that same test again to make sure everything is sealed. But now that I've loosened this up, watch what happens when I put my finger over the outlet. I'll plug it, the ball does not move, and when I let go, there's no sound, meaning the pressure has not built up in the jar or in the tubing. But if I get the jar, and notice I was drilling just a quarter turn or so, it was not very far, but it was just loose enough. Now if I do the same thing after tightening the lid, and I'll test it, the ball drops a bit, and when I let go, I get that pop, showing me that the jar is sealed tight. So that's a real good test to make sure that you're not losing any oxygen. And you can do that with using the prongs, pinching the prongs at the end of the tube. You can use it especially if you've got a very long tubing, a 25 or 50-foot tube, and it'll tell you that everything is put together snugly and you don't have any leaks.